The day my son handed me a $3,800 ring box to say thank you for 25 years of my life, I already knew it was a payoff for the $740,000 he had stolen from me. What he didn't know was that the original notarized partnership agreement was sealed inside a block of carving wax I'd kept on a shelf since the week we opened our doors. And that single block of wax, dismissed as sentimental clutter by the wife who threw it toward a trash bag, would be the forensic bomb that turned his entire future into a mandatory vest that reads, "Forged in Deceit," and a business model where every ring box prints his criminal filing number. My name is Elaine Voss. I am 53 years old, and the last time I trusted someone without a paper trail, I buried my husband. David was a structural engineer, a man who spent 32 years designing bridges and overpasses that would outlast the people who drove on them. He had a habit of testing small concrete samples in our garage, measuring the compressive strength with a hydraulic press he'd restored from a scrapyard, and he always said that truth was a load-bearing material. If you overloaded it, something would crack. He died 7 years ago on a wet Wednesday in October when a delivery truck with semi-certified brakes hydroplaned across a divider and struck his sedan broadside. He was driving home from the grocery store with a gallon of milk and a bag of Breeburn apples. The life insurance paid $107,000 after taxes and administrative fees, and instead of tucking it into a conservative annuity like the grief counselor suggested, I poured every cent into a handcrafted signaturing atelier with my only child. Marcus was 26 then, freshly graduated from a metalsmithing program in North Carolina. He had a portfolio of crestwork that was honestly very good. His soldering was clean. His repousse had a delicacy I hadn't seen from a student in years, and his smile, when he talked about family heirlooms, could sell intention to anyone in a 10-foot radius. We built the business together in a converted textile mill near the James River, high ceilings, good natural light, and I named it Hearth and Crest because I wanted it to feel like a hearthstone, the one thing in a home you could always orient yourself toward. I set up the bookkeeping infrastructure, the vendor contracts, the supply chain for ethically sourced casting grain, and the front-of-house client experience, but my deepest skill was always the wax. I learned lost wax carving from my father when I was 6. He was a dental technician who made crowns and bridges by day and sculpted miniatures by night, and he taught me how to read carving wax like Braille. I can hold a block of microcrystalline wax in my hand and feel a temperature differential of 0.5 degree that signals an internal stress fracture. I can carve a heraldic lion's mane into a 2-centimeter surface so cleanly that the finished gold reproduces every whisker without a single post-casting burr. That's the sort of detail that wins regional trade competitions and repeat commissions from families who want a signet ring they'll hand down for 6 generations. And that is why, when we sat at a small cherrywood table in front of Judge Arthur Holden, I held 45% of the equity in a notarized document that also carried a lifetime covenant. For every grandchild born into this bloodline, Marcus would cast a new family crest ring, using the original working patterns and my wax supervision, at no cost to the grandchild ever. It was a promise older and heavier than any metal, and I carved a small wax master of the Stag and Oak Leaf crest and pressed it into Arthur's palm that afternoon as a token. He closed his fingers around it like I'd handed him a rare coin. Arthur Holden was David's best man and the closest thing I had left to a second father. He had retired from the bench in Northern Virginia after 23 years of family law and civil litigation, and he'd taken a small apartment near the Chesapeake because he said a retired judge knows exactly how much silence is worth. He fished for Croker and Spot, read worn paperback thrillers, and kept a single file drawer of the things that mattered. 3 weeks ago, his heart stopped while he was reading a fishing catalog on a Tuesday afternoon. The superintendent found him the next morning, still in his recliner, glasses perched on his forehead. I drove 4 hours to his apartment with a duffel bag and the intention of packing his personal effects before some indifferent estate liquidator swept through. By the time I parked in the visitor lot, Marcus and his wife Brenda were already there. They had driven a Range Rover that still smelled of dealership leather, and they wore matching expressions of orchestrated grief. Brenda kept touching my arm and calling me Mama Elaine, a phrase she had never used once in the 8 years I'd known her. She was dressed in a black cashmere turtleneck and gold earrings that I recognized as one of our early hearth and crest designs, a pair of acorn-shaped drops. I'd cast myself in 18-karat gold. Marcus, my golden son who could solder gold granules into micro-sculptural vines, was pacing the living room talking about the estate timeline and probate asset schedules with a fluency that sounded rehearsed. He had a manila folder already tucked under his arm, and he kept glancing at the small wooden shelf next to Arthur's recliner, where the old man kept the things I had given him over the years. A framed photo of David on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge fishing trip, 1998, a porcelain osprey I'd bought at a craft fair in Ononcock, and the carved wax block, the matchbox-sized master of the stag crest, still sitting exactly where Arthur had placed it 7 years ago. Brenda lifted it between 2 fingers like a dead cockroach. "What is this, sentimental wax?" Her voice had a reedy disgust. She tossed it toward an open contractor bag that already held old magazines and a broken desk lamp. Marcus glanced over and said, "Just old craft stuff. We can toss that bag." I said nothing. I watched the block disappear under a layer of yellowed newspapers and waited. 15 minutes later, while Brenda was on a phone call in the galley kitchen with someone she kept calling, the underwriter, in a hushed tone, and Marcus was photographing Arthur's stamp collection for resale valuation, I crouched, reached into the bag, and retrieved the wax block like I was pulling a pin from a live grenade. I slid it into my coat pocket. That night in a Hampton Inn 12 miles away, I sat cross-legged on the polyester bedspread and held the block under a gooseneck lamp. It looked exactly as it always had, a warm Osher microcrystalline wax with my maker's mark stamped into the bottom and the raised relief of a stag's head surrounded by oak leaves. But there was a hairline seam I had never carved, a fracture line that ran around the entire perimeter of the block, so fine it could pass for a drying crack, unless you had spent 40 years reading wax like a language. I used a disposable scalpel from my field kit. I always travel with a small roll of carving tools, an old habit, and worked the seam with the flat edge. The top third of the block lifted away like a small lid, the wax yielding with a soft click. Inside, a shallow cavity had been machined with what looked like a hot dental instrument, the walls smooth and slightly glossy. Nestled in that cavity was a folded square of heavy, 24-pound linen finish paper and a flash drive taped to the lid with black gaffer tape. I unfolded the paper first. It was a fully executed copy of the Hearth and Crest Partnership Agreement, all 6 pages, and on every page was Judge Arthur Holden's notary stamp, his crisp fountain pen signature in cobalt blue, and my own slightly uneven signature from the day my wrist was still recovering from carpal tunnel syndrome. Attached to the last page by a paperclip was a small note on Arthur's personal letterhead, written in the same ink. It said, "Elaine, Marcus came to me last week with a new set of incorporation papers that remove you entirely. He's desperate. He mentioned a sterling deal and a bridge loan I don't like the smell of. I hid this original. Do not trust them. Save yourself." I read that sentence 12 times while the ice machine hummed through the wall. Then I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. The drive contained 3 subdirectories. The first was labeled Tax Filings, and it held scanned 1,040 schedules and state business returns for something called Crest IP Holdings LLC, with Marcus listed as sole managing member and an address that corresponded to a P.O. box in Richmond. The second was labeled Directorship, a PDF showing the same entity incorporated 18 months prior, with a registered agent service in Dover, Delaware. The third was a voice memo, time-stamped 2 days before Arthur's death. I played it. His voice was dry and careful, with the slight Virginia Tidewater lilt he'd never lost. He still thinks a judge can just make paper disappear. He came here with a prepared affidavit, very neat, very typed, asking me to expunge the original notarization because it was superseded by new articles. I told him I'd look into it. "I'm leaving this for you, Elaine, and I'm adding a countermeasure he won't see until it's far too late. There's a small trust company in Annapolis. I'll handle it. You just survive." I did not sleep that night. I sat there, the wax block in my lap, and I started mapping the architecture of a reverse heist. I thought about David and his load-bearing truths, about the concrete samples in the garage, about the way he'd taught me to read a stress fracture. And I thought about Marcus as a 7-year-old, sitting at my workbench with a ball of clay, trying to shape a tiny lion because he wanted to be just like me. That memory felt like a photograph from another life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that a family crest means nothing when the blood running underneath it has already turned to ice water. I'll wait. The manipulation started the morning after I returned from Arthur's apartment. I was standing at my kitchen island, still exhausted, when Marcus appeared with a folder of crisp, laser-printed documents and a thermos of the cold brew coffee he knows I favor for headaches. Brenda stood slightly behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder in what I think she had practiced in a mirror as gentle spousal support. She smelled of expensive perfume and faint anxiety. Marcus began a recitation that sounded like he'd swallowed a business law textbook. The studio had supposedly taken on water while I wasn't looking. The equipment leases were coming due. The landlord of our Richmond mill had sold the building to a commercial developer, and my 45% equity was at risk of dilution or personal liability unless we restructured the corporate umbrella. He used words like reverse triangular merger and assignment of intangible assets and indemnification arc until they blurred into background noise, but I understood exactly what he was proposing. The central documents were a power of attorney declaration that would grant him full administrative control over my shares, and a contingent asset transfer instrument that would, under certain conditions, move those shares into a trust administered by Brenda's brother, who was a CPA in Bethesda. They also wanted me to move into the in-law suite over their heated garage. Because grief is easier when you're not rattling around alone, Brenda said, her voice dripping with counterfeit warmth. We have a lovely little kitchenette up there, a separate entrance. You'll have all your privacy, but we're right downstairs if you need anything. I stared at the papers, letting my eyes go soft. I fumbled the pen twice, intentionally. I asked Brenda to fetch my reading glasses from the credenza across the room. When she turned, I palmed a tiny digital copy of the power of attorney form using a pen scanner smaller than a tube of lipstick. I had bought that scanner 3 years ago for an inventory tracking system project that never took off, and I'd kept it in my purse out of sheer pack-rat instinct. The scanner captured every micron of the document's text in under 4 seconds. I'm just so foggy right now, I said, pressing a thumb to my temple. Arthur's death, the business. I can't think clearly. Can we sleep on it? I just need a day or two. Marcus's jaw tightened, a tiny movement, the same one he'd made as a teenager when I told him he couldn't borrow the car. But Brenda, the smoother operator, stepped in. Of course, Mama Elaine, we just want to take care of you. Pack a bag, the suite is ready. I've already put fresh linens on the bed. I packed a bag that afternoon. I packed the wax block, the flash drive, 2 sets of jeweler's loops, a jeweler's scale accurate to 1/100th of a gram, and a set of hand-carved wax tools in a padded roll that I told Brenda was my arthritis kit. I have never had arthritis. I also packed a small digital voice recorder, a telescoping inspection mirror, and a leather-bound journal that I would fill with time-stamped notes over the coming weeks. Living in their house was like being installed inside a diorama of prosperity that was secretly funded on margin calls. Marcus worked long hours at the studio, or so he said, but by the 4th day I had mapped the rhythm of the house. He left at 7:15. Brenda left at 9 for what she called the gallery board, but never brought home any artwork, and I had the place to myself most days from 9 to 4, with the exception of a cleaning service that came on Wednesdays. The frantic phone calls started within 48 hours of my arrival. Brenda took most of them in the walk-in pantry with the door pulled shut, but the pantry was adjacent to the laundry room vent, and if I stood in the laundry room with the dryer running empty on a fluff cycle, I could hear every syllable with startling clarity. She argued with a loan officer at a regional bank about something called a compensating balance they had failed to maintain. She said, "We'll have the liquidity by the 15th. The sterling close is imminent, you know that." And the voice on the other end said something about acceleration clauses. Another call, 3 days later, was with a title company in Williamsburg that was holding disbursement on a property flip. The words cross-collateralization default came through a dozen times, and toward the end she dropped her voice and said, "We have a personal guarantor. It's all documented. We can paper over the gap." The personal guarantor, I would later learn, was me. Marcus, meanwhile, spent his evenings pacing the great room with a phone pressed to his ear, dodging calls from a number I later identified as the general counsel for Sterling and Company, the luxury jewelry chain that had reportedly made the $740,000 offer for Hearth and Crest's design library and branding. He'd answer the call, say, "I'm working on it. It's a timing issue," then hang up and stare at the wall for a full minute before calling someone else. I stood in the upstairs hallway, still as a mannequin, and logged every one of these moments in my journal with dates, times, and partial quotes. I also discovered that my in-law suite had a small linen closet with a false back panel, a leftover from an old laundry chute, and I used it to store the growing file of evidence. The garbage disposal incident happened on a Tuesday morning, my 9th day in the house. Brenda was trying to make a smoothie and had apparently fed half a stale baguette and a frozen chicken bone into the disposal before turning it on. The unit seized with a mechanical groan. She stood in front of it, pressing the reset button over and over, while Marcus searched YouTube on his phone for disposal not spinning and watched a video of a man explaining the Allen wrench override port. They didn't own an Allen wrench in the correct size. I walked into the kitchen, having heard the commotion from upstairs, and watched them for 30 seconds. Brenda was now trying to stick a butter knife into the drain. I retrieved a bent nose pliers and a wire coat hanger from the utility drawer, cut a straight section with the garage tin snips, bent a precise 3/4-inch hook on the end, reached into the drain past the rubber splash guard, hooked the jammed impeller blade, and worked it back and forth until it freed with a wet grind. The entire repair took 18 seconds. I pressed the reset button, the disposal hummed to life, and I washed my hands at the sink. Brenda stared at me like I had performed open-heart surgery on a dolphin. "How did you do that?" she asked. "I used to fix my father's casting centrifuge with a hairpin and a prayer," I said, drying my hands on a towel. "Old muscles remember." That was true, actually. Marcus looked at the wet hanger in my hand and said nothing, but his expression flickered in a way I filed carefully away. He was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that I was not a foggy old woman. I was a woman who understood mechanics, tension, and the failure points of a system. That night was a gallery opening in the Fan District, some kind of contemporary metals exhibition that Brenda had been talking about for days. Marcus and Brenda left at 6:30, dressed in coordinated dark neutrals, and the moment their taillights cleared the driveway, I went into Marcus's home office. The door had a keyed knob, but the lock was a quickset of exactly the pin tumbler variety I had learned to rake at 15 when my Uncle Bernie, a licensed locksmith in Norfolk, used to set me up with practice cylinders during slow summer afternoons. He taught me the mechanics of shear lines, the feel of a binding pin stack, the difference between a standard pin and a spool. I kept a small lockpick kit inside a hollowed-out section of my wax tool roll, a tension wrench I'd made from spring steel, a half-diamond pick crafted from a repurposed jeweler's burnisher. I knelt in front of the doorknob, inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applied light rotational pressure, and began raking the pins with the diamond pick. On the third pass, the lock surrendered with a soft rotational click. 90 seconds. Inside, the office was meticulously organized, Spanish-style desk, leather blotter, a tall black filing cabinet next to the window. The filing cabinet had a tubular cam lock, which is harder to pick than a standard pin tumbler. I had never actually defeated a tubular lock before, but my Uncle Bernie had once explained the theory. You could impression the pin positions using a compliant material. I had a roll of low-temperature thermoplastic wax in my kit, the kind I use for making temporary molds of tiny parts. I also had a fine-point heat pen for precise waxwork. I warmed a pea-sized ball of the thermoplastic to a workable consistency, pressed it firmly into the lock barrel, and held it steady while the wax cooled and hardened. When I removed it, the indentations of the 7-pin stacks were visible, little circular dimples at varying depths. I used my scalpel to carve a temporary key from a block of dense sprue wax, mapping the depths based on those impressions. It was ugly and imprecise, and the first 2 attempts sheared off in the lock. On the third attempt, I felt the bolt retract. The cabinet drawer slid open with a heavy, satisfying sound. Inside were hanging folders organized by colored tabs. Orange tabs were labeled Sterling Transaction. I opened the first folder and found the full asset purchase proposal from Sterling and Company. $740,000 for all design patents, the brand trademark, the client list, and the proprietary Crest generation software. I had written myself over 2 years of late nights, learning coding from library books. The software was an algorithm that took a family's historical motifs and generated a compositionally balanced crest layout. It was my intellectual baby, and I had never assigned the copyright to the partnership. The proposal's closing date was contingent on the resolution of minority interest encumbrance, which was corporate speak for my 45%. Behind that, a separate folder held a set of updated partnership minutes, dated 7 days after Arthur's death. The document purported to remove me as a member of the LLC and sell my interest to Marcus for the explicit consideration of $3,800. The signature on the page was supposed to be mine. I took a macro lens photo with my phone and zoomed in until the ink fibers were visible. I had studied forensic handwriting analysis for 18 months during a contract tracing project for a private mint. I knew what I was looking at. The E in Elaine had a loop that trailed too high and too shallow, missing the tight retrace I'd used since I was a teenager. The terminal stroke of the S at the end of Voss was wobbled, a classic sign of a traced signature done by a forger who doesn't understand the writer's natural momentum. A genuine signature has velocity, micro-tremors of muscle memory. A forged one has hesitation that shows up as uneven ink density. I measured the letter spacing against a scan of my genuine signature from the original partnership agreement and found discrepancies of up to 4 millimeters in the horizontal placement of the crossbar on the T in Elaine. This was not a mistake. This was a deliberate forgery, and it valued my lifetime of work at a figure that exactly matched the price of the ring box he would later hand me. The final folder made my stomach colder than the wax I had been carving. It contained a promissory note for $92,000, taken by Crest IP Holdings LLC and personally guaranteed by Elaine Voss. The signature was the same clumsy forgery. The note was already in default, and the creditor, a hard money lender in Baltimore, had filed an acceleration notice on the full balance plus default interest at 22%. Marcus had used my name, my credit, my existence, to paper over his own liquidity crisis, and he had structured the fraud so that when the sterling sale inevitably collapsed, the debt would land squarely on me. I was the scapegoat, the human collateral, the old mother whose foggy compliance he had intended to monetize down to the last dollar. I photographed every page, including the acceleration notice with its filing stamp and case number, replaced the folders exactly as I had found them, locked the cabinet, and cleaned the lock's keyway of any wax residue with a fine needle. I left the office with the clockwork precision of a woman who has just been promoted from victim to instrument. The next morning, I called the one number Arthur had written on the bottom of his letterhead note. It was a small estate law practice in Annapolis. The lawyer who answered was a woman named Carla Thiessen, and her voice changed sharply when I spoke Arthur's name. She said, "He told me to expect your call, though he didn't know when. Can you come in?" 2 days later, I drove to Annapolis, taking a circuitous route in case Marcus had a tracking device on my car, a precaution I now realize sounds paranoid but felt entirely reasonable. Carla's office was in a restored Victorian on a side street, and she had a view of the Severn River through a bay window. I sat in an oak chair and laid out the wax block, the original partnership agreement, the flash drive, my phone's photo library of the forged documents, and my journal of logged phone calls. Carla was a woman around 60, with silver hair pulled back in a clip and the demeanor of someone who has seen every variation of human greed and no longer finds it surprising. She listened without interruption for 40 minutes, then slid a file folder across the table. Inside was a document titled Biometric Verification Directive for Intangible Property Transfer, recorded with the county clerk's office 11 months prior. Arthur had apparently been busy. As the notary who had witnessed our original agreement, he had concurrently filed an ancillary affidavit attesting that the partnership's intellectual property could not be assigned, sold, or encumbered without the physical, live-scanned fingerprint of Elaine Voss, specifically the right index finger that had been digitally imaged at the original notarization ceremony. The scan had been captured with a high-resolution fingerprint reader and stored with a local trust company, Sterling Trust Services, which was entirely unrelated to Sterling and Company, a happy and confusing coincidence of names. The trust company operated as a disinterested escrow agent. Arthur had built a dead man's switch into the very skeleton of our business. Without my finger, no sale could ever clear title. Marcus didn't know. He had relied on his own forged expungement paperwork and had never checked the public filings on a deeper title search because he was too arrogant to imagine a retired judge would go to war from the grave. Carla also told me that she had been in contact with a federal investigator who was already looking at Sterling and Company for a pattern of predatory acquisitions targeting small independent jewelers in the Mid-Atlantic. She gave me a phone number. I called from a payphone outside a 7-Eleven, just to be safe. The agent who met me 3 days later was named Luis Ruiz, a quiet man in his 40s, who worked art and cultural property fraud for the FBI's Richmond field office. We met in a coffee shop in a strip mall outside Petersburg, far enough from Richmond that no one would recognize my face. He told me that a whistleblower inside Sterling's legal department had leaked an internal memo about clearing the minority encumbrance via fiduciary truncation, and that the memo had mentioned Hearth and Crest by name. He asked me to do 2 things. First, keep a detailed digital log of every interaction, every overheard call, every document I saw, which I was already doing. Second, he handed me a small rubber-coated USB device that looked like a generic power brick, the kind you'd plug into a wall to charge a phone. It was actually a network forensics tool. If I plugged it into Marcus's home router for a minimum of 6 hours, it would mirror all network traffic and map the connections between his devices, the Shadow LLC's bank, the hard money lender, and the Sterling acquisition team. I agreed without hesitation. That night, I plugged the device into the router in their utility closet while they were asleep, and I left it there for 10 hours. The data it captured would later prove the full chain of fraudulent communication. I returned to the in-law suite and began to map the final phase. But before I could execute anything, I needed to know whether any flicker of human loyalty remained in the child I had raised. So I staged my medical scare on a Friday evening after a week of careful preparation. I had acquired a small bottle of liquid magnesium citrate from a drugstore, claiming it was for a digestive issue, and I knew from a medical reference book that a small dose could induce a temporary pallor, sweating, and a convincingly faint pulse. I mixed a measured amount into my afternoon tea at 5 o'clock. By 6:30, my skin was clammy, my heart was jumping in a way that felt real, and I walked into the great room clutching my chest, my breathing coming in shallow, ragged bursts. I let my knees buckle and collapse sideways onto the Persian rug, one arm thrown out, my face turned toward the coffee table where I had placed a large manila envelope marked Sterling Trust, personal and confidential in red ink. The envelope was empty, just a prop. Brenda, seated on the sofa with her phone, looked up. She did not call 911. She did not run to my side. Her eyes went to the envelope. She said, "Marcus," in a flat tone, and Marcus came through the kitchen doorway. He saw me on the floor, saw the envelope, and his face lit up with something I can only describe as hunger. He stepped over my leg, his loafer brushing my shin, and grabbed the envelope like a child grabbing a present. He ripped it open, and when he saw it was empty, his expression collapsed into fury. "Where's the document, Elaine?" My name, not Mom. Then Brenda knelt beside me, but not to check my airway. She started rifling through my cardigan pocket. I counted 23 seconds before she even looked at my face. I feigned a slow recovery, mumbling about low blood sugar, and let them guide me to a chair. I drank the glass of water they handed me because it was easier than continuing the performance. But inside, the last soft edge of maternal hope had been cauterized for good. I thought about the 7-year-old with the clay lion. I thought about the teenager I'd taught to carve his first signet ring, a simple chevron pattern, his fingers so careful. That boy was gone, or maybe he had never been. Maybe I had carved him in wax, and the metal that came out of the mold was always base. I would destroy them, and I would use their own greed as the binding agent. The confrontation came 8 days later. Marcus told me we had to go to Sterling Trust Services in Norfolk to release a small administrative hold on the membership shares so the Sterling and Company sale could close. He framed it as a formality, just a quick fingerprint scan, then a celebratory lunch at a nice seafood spot on the Elizabeth River. I dressed carefully that morning, a dove-gray jacket with deep inner pockets, my late husband's watch with the scratched crystal, and an antique silver brooch pinned to my lapel, a brooch that held a tiny hidden recording device activated by a clasp switch. Brenda drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel the entire 2-hour trip. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, rehearsing lines under his breath, occasionally glancing at a legal pad with bullet points. They were nervous. I could smell it, a sharp edge under Brenda's perfume. At the trust company, we were ushered into a conference room with a polished granite table and a large monitor on the far wall. A trust officer named Mr. Kwan introduced himself with a measured calm that told me he had been briefed. On the monitor, via video link, were 3 representatives from Sterling and Company, a vice president, a transactions lawyer, and their general counsel, all in dark suits, all looking cautiously optimistic. Marcus slid a document across the table, a biometric release authorization that, if I scan my right index finger, would dissolve Arthur's encumbrance and allow the IP transfer to proceed. He clicked a pen and placed it next to my hand. His smile was the same one he'd used to sell heirloom-grade intention to hundreds of clients. I didn't pick up the pen. I stood, unclipped my brooch, and placed it speaker side up on the granite. Then I took my phone from my jacket and queued up a recording. I played the audio of Brenda's pantry conversation with the hard money lender, the one where she said the words, cross-collateralization default, and mentioned my name as the personal guarantor. The room went very still. Next, I pulled out a folder from my jacket and spread its contents on the table. Printed photos of the forged partnership minutes, the traced signature with my macro lens overlay analysis, the $3,800 consideration document, and the promissory note with the acceleration notice. I arranged them in a neat row, the way I used to arrange wax carvings for a client presentation. Finally, I produced the wax block itself. I opened it in front of Marcus for the first time, lifting the carved lid, and I held up the original notarized partnership agreement and Arthur's note. I read the note aloud, slowly, making direct eye contact with the Sterling and Company general counsel on the monitor. Marcus tried to laugh. It was a hollow, dry sound. He said, "This is a theatrical meltdown. She's been grieving. She doesn't know what she's saying. Arthur was senile. The note is manufactured." I said, "Arthur saw you coming, Marcus, and I see you now. You never understood that a crest isn't about the metal. It's about the blood and the truth. And yours ran so thin you tried to forge it, which is exactly why this room is wired." Mr. Kwan pressed a discreet button under the table edge, and less than 20 seconds later, the conference room door opened. Agent Ruiz walked in with 2 uniformed FBI agents and a forensic accountant who was already holding a subpoena for the trust company's transaction records. They arrested Marcus and Brenda on charges of forgery, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, elder financial abuse, and identity theft. The Sterling counsel started stammering about corporate due diligence failures and trying to distance himself from the acquisition. I didn't listen. I just looked at the wax block in my hand, the stag's head catching the fluorescent light, the little cavity that had held a dead man's prophecy. The aftermath unspooled over the next 14 months, like the deliberate machining of a chronograph. Marcus's legal team quickly realized the evidence was overwhelming. The network traffic logs from my USB device had captured emails in which he acknowledged the forgery to the lender. The biometric directive was airtight, and the forensic handwriting report from an independent examiner confirmed the signature was a trace forgery with 14 points of diverging characteristics. He took a plea deal. 4 years in a state facility for financial fraud, and an additional 2 years for the elder abuse charge, arranged concurrently after a string of former clients and colleagues from the Atelier community testified about his systematic theft of designs and his pattern of manipulation. Brenda received 18 months and 5 years of supervised probation. During her probation, she was ordered to liquidate their assets to satisfy restitution, and I quietly monitored the estate sales from a distance. The Range Rover, the Persian rug, the designer furniture, all sold at a fraction of their cost. The hard money lender in Baltimore was sanctioned by the State Banking Commission for failing to verify the guarantor's identity, and the $92,000 promissory note was voided by a court order, meaning I bore no liability for it at all. Sterling and Company, desperate to avoid a public lawsuit that would tarnish their luxury brand and expose their predatory acquisition pattern, entered into a negotiation with Carla Theisen. They agreed to a licensing settlement that paid me $300,000 while leaving all design rights, trademarks, and the Crest Generation software with me. Arthur's dead man's switch had worked so completely that the escrow company actually sent me a framed certificate attesting to the integrity of the original fingerprint registration. I hung it on the wall of my new office. I renamed the business Ring of Perjury Heirlooms. It felt precise, a name that honored both the craft and the lesson. I restructured the workshop as a small collective of independent artisans, and I brought in 2 younger carvers whom I paid a fair wage and mentored in lost wax technique. But I also wanted something else. I contacted the State Department of Corrections with a proposal, a supervised rehabilitation arrangement in which Marcus's mandatory community service hours could be served in a controlled workshop environment. I specified that he would perform basic finishing work, polishing and buffing, under direct oversight, and he would never be allowed to access the design files or the wax carving stations. The sentencing judge signed off after a rehabilitation services review and a security assessment of the workshop's layout. And so, 3 mornings a week, my son sits at a bench in the polishing room wearing a vest I had a seamstress friend design. The vest is navy blue, with gold lettering across the back that reads, "Forged in Deceit." He uses a rotary polisher and a progression of rouge compounds to bring finished rings to a high luster, and he is not allowed to speak to clients or attend any design meetings. Every piece of jewelry that leaves our shop now ships in a small hinged box with an insert card that lists the date, the carat weight of the metal, the alloy fineness, and his criminal filing number, along with a line that says, "This heirloom is guaranteed free of fraud, collusion, or forged intent." The first time I saw a customer read that card and nod slowly, I felt something in my chest that was not satisfaction, exactly, but the quiet settling of a beam into true load. I keep the wax block in a display case in my office, next to Arthur's note and the clumsy forgery of my own signature. I look at it most days around 4 in the afternoon, when the light angles through the workshop windows and the smell of sprue-cutting dust hangs in the air. I think about structural truths, the kind David spent his life engineering, and the kind Arthur protected with a fingerprint and a paperclip. A family crest is not carved from ambition or branding. It is carved from the quiet refusal to be collateral, from the moment you pull a piece of wax out of a trash bag and decide it is worth more than blood that never pumped for you anyway. I still carve most mornings, and every time I pick up my scalpel, I remember that the negative space, the material you remove, is just as important as the metal that fills it. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? If this story stuck with you, hit like and subscribe and share a comment below. Truth leaves a mark deeper than any ring, and I'll be back with another story soon.